Hello and welcome to the Byzantine Scotus. Today I'm going to be talking about the Thomistic Theses. So, for those who don't know, the under Pope Saint Pius X, it was required that Thomism be taught in seminaries, and I actually think that this makes a lot of sense given the context of the time. Because at the time we were seeing that modernism was raging all throughout the Catholic world and had filled up the seminaries. And so as a result, it made sense to have some sort of clear teaching of what should be taught in the seminaries. And St. Thomas's works had been collected and edited, and so it made sense to use these as the main thing that would be taught. And it was under, I think, actually the next Pope, Benedict XV, that there were some questions about what actually constituted the Thomism that should be taught. So they came up with this list of 24 propositions, primarily in metaphysics, but also touching on some other subjects as well, of what constitutes Thomism and what had to be taught in seminaries at the time. Now, it's important to note, though, this was never required as doctrine. This is what was being taught in the seminaries, and that was it, right? And so they needed something clear to do that. And so it's perfectly fine for a Catholic to disagree with any one of these theses or all of them, and they're even no longer required to be taught in seminary. St. Thomas is still required to be taught in seminary. That's still part of canon law. But these specific theses are no longer required to be taught. And I've had quite a number of people ask me about differences between Thomism and Scotism. And I don't think this list sort of sums up the differences or anything like that. But I thought this would be an interesting representation of things that Thomists in the early 20th century considered the sort of essential metaphysical principles of Thomism. And I thought I would take a look at them and see which ones I would disagree with and which ones I would agree with, or maybe I want some nuance on them. I thought I'd just take a look at that. So hopefully people will find this interesting. So let me pull them up here. Can everyone read this? I'm going to wait just to get a confirmation of that people can read this before I start going through it. So let me know in the chat if you can. And you probably want to look here at the non-bold text. The bold text is going to be in Latin. I'm not getting anything. Okay, yeah, people can read it. All right, so I'll go in and start looking at it. Yep. So after our most holy father, Pius X, ordered in the motu proprio Doctoris Angelici on June 29th, 1914, that in all the schools of philosophy, the principles and main teachings of Thomas Aquinas be held, some teachers from various institutions proposed some theses for the sacred congregation to examine, which theses they had been accustomed to teach and defend as being those of the holy teacher St. Thomas, especially in metaphysics. The sacred congregation, having duly examined the aforementioned theses, and having presented them to the Holy Father, by the mandate of His Holiness, declares that they contain clearly the principles and more important thoughts of the Holy Doctor. This is just things that are going to be required to be taught as some of the essential principles of St. Thomas. They don't summarize everything St. Thomas taught. They're not even required to be taught in seminary anymore, but they provide a good view into some of these essential metaphysical principles. All right, so the first few principles discuss ontology. And it's just the part in bold here, the Latin actually, that's the original of what was approved by the Pope. There's then a translation below it, and then a commentary added by, who is the priest? Father Lumbreras, who looks like he's Dominican, translated this and also gave a commentary to explain what is meant by these, and also give some citations from St. Thomas, or if you want to read more on this. All right, so Thesis 1, potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists is either a pure act or is necessarily composed of potency and act, as to its primordial and intrinsic principles. So those who don't know, essentially, act, it's a lot more complicated than this, but to sort of summarize, act is essentially something being in its fullness, essentially, versus potency would be some limitation, right? So God is most fully beings. Probably not the best explanation I can come off the top of my head, but these are essentially the primary principles that we're working with in Aristotelian metaphysics. Something is either in act or it's limited somehow, right? And this is where we get the word actual from, is act, or actus in the Latin here. So I wouldn't disagree that all things are divided either into pure act or some mix of potency and act. But I would say that for Scotus, this is not the only primary division of being. And so St. Thomas starts off with looking at how things in the world are in potency and act, and abstracts out from there a larger metaphysical system of potency and act, as Aristotle does. While Scotus instead looks at being and St. Thomas defines beings. They both agree that being is the subject of metaphysics. Metaphysics is the study of being as being. But Thomas defines being as actuality, while Scotus defines being simply as that to which to be is not repugnant, right? So simply being for Scotus, to summarize that, essentially means to exist. And so Scotus says that, right, we don't have just pure being on its own. We have being divided into different things whenever we observe it. So we have this concept, which is basically just to be. And it can be divided either into finite being or infinite being, right? Which is really Scotus thinks of as the primary division. But also it could be divided as potency and act. It could be divided as participated and unparticipated. There could be lots of these divisions. And so Scotus isn't going to say that potency and act is sort of this only primary division. He'd say all of those are just as much primary divisions of being as potency and act. And Scotus tends to prefer the division between finite and infinite as the primary division. But so to be clear, I'm not disagreeing with the first thesis. I'm saying that I would say that there's more to it than just that thesis. I'd say that this thesis is a subset of a larger category, that if we were to write a Scotus 24 theses, this one would be a little bit longer. It wouldn't just discuss potency and act as this division of being. All right, so number 2. And to go on to that potency and act, Scotus tends to be more interested in potency and act as regards discussion of physics, so the study of the natural world. And it doesn't tend to show up as much in his metaphysics. Well, for Thomas, this principle works both for physics and it's just as well for metaphysics. All right, thesis 2. Act, because it is perfection, is not limited except by potency, which is capacity for perfection. Therefore, in the order in which the act is pure, it is unlimited and unique. But in that in which it is finite and manifold, it comes into a true composition with potency. Yeah, I don't see any issue with that here. Right, this is just saying that act is perfection that's limited by potency. That's just the definition of those. All right, Thesis 3. Wherefore, in the exclusive domain of existence itself, God alone subsists. He alone is most simple. Everything else which participates in existence has a nature whereby existence is restricted and is composed of essence and existence as two really distinct principles. So I don't see any issue with the first part. In the exclusive domain of existence, God alone exists. He alone is the most simple. I don't see anything with the first half of the second part, that everything else participates in existence and as a nature whereby its existence this, I think, where we get to it is has a nature whereby its existence is restricted and is composed of essence and existence as of two really distinct principles. Now, this last little bit of it is even controversial among some Thomists, because we don't want to say, and some people, Thomists have said, that the relationship between being and essence is the relationship of race to race, of a thing to another thing. And if it's the relationship of a thing to another thing that we're talking about here, I don't think a Scotist would agree with that at all. I mean, Scotist directly took issue with, I think it was Giles of Rome, because Giles argued for two really distinct things that are combined. But if we understand it simply as a certain mode in which a thing exists, I don't think Scotus would take huge issue with that. The Scotus is only targeting Giles of Rome's explanation of what we mean by two really distinct principles, which is two things. But if we mean we're not saying the same thing about them, I don't think we'd take huge issue. But I think it's really more of a formal modal distinction, that something exists in the mind or in actuality is simply different modes in which it exists, not that we've taken another principle and added to it. I don't think this St. Thomas wants to liken it to form and matter, but I don't think that form and matter is the correct analogy when we're talking about essence and being. So this one sort of agree with the beginning, and as it goes on, I start disagreeing more and more. I don't have any issue with participates in existence, though. Some people think that Scotus doesn't have a doctrine of participation because he doesn't discuss it much, but when he's listing the divisions of being, he lists participated and unparticipated as one of those divisions. So he acknowledges that created things participate in being, but he isn't all that interested in discussing the details of the subject. All right, so Thesis 4. Being, which derives its name from existence, is not predicated univocally of God and creatures, nor yet merely equivocally, but analogically, by the analogy both of attribution and of proportionality. Right, so this first part, being, which derives its name from existence, doesn't make any sense in English, but if you read it in the Latins, ens quod denominator ab esse. Right, so beings, right, so ens is a participle, the thing that is existing, which is named from to exist, or to be. Right, so ens is essentially, we've taken the word to be, and we've turned it into a noun, so we can discuss things that exist. And yeah, I'd agree that that's a correct etymology for it. But we get to this next part, is not predicated univocally of God and creatures, nor merely equivocally, but analogically, by the analogy of attribution and of proportionality. Here's where I would take issue with it. If what we mean by not univocally is that it's not the same thing, well, yes, created beings and God aren't the same sorts of things, but if we simply mean the word to be itself, that is indeed predicated of God and creatures in a sense univocally. Because what is the definition of to be? The definition of to be is simply that which to be is not repugnant, right? So it simply is to exist. And God and creatures are both to be, they both exist. So in that sense, it's univocal. And now the Thomists would agree it's not equivocally, but it's by analogy. And how is it an analogy? It's of attribution and proportionality. Right. So it's analogy, right? Here's a good explanation here in the commentary. So its analogy is first that of attribution, since being pertains to creatures as far as they have it from God, to whom it appertains by essence, and secondly, it is by proportionality, since the actuality of existence is intrinsic to God and creatures as existing beings. Right, so it's saying that, right, we receive our being from God, and God is infinitely greater than us. And I would agree with both those things. But we have to get back to the fundamental question here of univocal means we're using the same definition, right? So metaphysically, there's an analogy going on here, right? That we don't have that being in the same way. We have it in a finite and created mode, whereas God has it in an infinite and uncreated mode, right? This is of proportionality and attribution. But when we're speaking in terms of logic, analogy cannot work in logic, right? Either something is a proper middle term in the syllogism, or it is not a proper middle term because it is equivocal, it doesn't have the same definition. And logically, when we are discussing to be, we are using the same definition of to be. The concept is logically the same. And so in that sense, it is still univocal. So we have to ask, in what sense are we saying it is not predicated univocally? Because logically, it is predicated univocally. And it has to be predicated logically univocally. Because otherwise, you can't have a metaphysical analogy. Right? Analogy requires that there be some underlying sameness, which we're discussing. And so if we're going to say that there can't be a logical univocity, it would have to be equivocity. Because equivocity, simply the definition of it is it's not univocal. Analogy is not a third way between univocity and equivocity. Analogy is a type of equivocity where there's an underlying element which is univocal. If you go look in any ancient logician, go back to Aristotle, that's how analogy is understood. Not entirely the univocally part, but it's understood as a type of equivocity. All right, Thesis 5. There is, moreover, in every creature a real composition of subsisting subject with forms secondarily added, that is, accidents. But such a composition could not be understood unless the existence were received into a distinct essence. So I wouldn't disagree with that you have accidental form, which is distinct from substantial form. But if the reason we're going to have here is because of the essence-existence distinction, that's going to take some issue. And so it's going to have the same issue I'm going to have above. And we'll get to this with a later thesis, but for Scotus, something can just simply have multiple forms within it. And so this having multiple forms in a thing isn't an issue that needs to be explained away like it does in St. Thomas. So I think here we're agreeing on the conclusion, but the logic of how we get there is going to be slightly different because of our different principles. All right, Thesis 6. Besides the absolute accidents, there is also a relative accident or towards something. For although towards something does not mean, by its own nature, anything inhering in something frequently, however, it has a cause in things, and therefore a really distinct entity distinct from the subject. I don't take any issue with this. This is simply the Augustinian idea that relation as an accident doesn't work like the rest of the accidents do, because you need two things to have a relation. That's fair? All right, Thesis 7. The spiritual creature is as to its essence altogether simple, yet there remains a twofold composition in it, that namely of essence with existence, and that of substance with accidents. So Scotus would take significant issue with this, because for Scotus, angels have a spiritual matter to them still. And so as a result of angels having a spiritual matter, form cannot change. There has to be something that can change. And so there has to be a spiritual matter that can change. Now, for earlier Franciscans, the primary reason for arguing for spiritual matter was individuation, which we'll get to in the next section. Scotus doesn't need it for individuation. So that's what we're going to get into. He has hypseity as a way to explain individuation. But he still thinks it's useful to explain change within the angels. And so as a result, I think for reasons we mostly already gotten into, I would have to take issue with this, because I'm not going to affirm a real composition of between essence and existence for reasons I already explained. All right, before I take a look at the next section, I'm going to look through the comments. There are no comments regarding. I've seen comments and other stuff, but I'll touch on those later on. I'm just going to touch on, for right now, I'm just going to touch on comments directly related to the theses I've been reading. All right. Thesis 8. Now we're getting into cosmology. The corporeal creature, on the contrary, is in its very essence composed of potency and act. Such a potency and act is of the essential order, are designated by the names form and matter. I, of course, wouldn't take any issue with this, but I'd say that this also applies to angels as well. All right, Thesis 9. Neither of those parts has existence, properly speaking, nor is produced or destroyed, nor is placed in a category except by way of reduction, as a substantial principle. Trying to figure out what this is. I'll read the commentary, figure out what this is saying. I read through these all before, but now I confused myself here. All right. Since existence is the active essence, it makes essence actual. Neither form nor matter can be granted an existence of its own. The existence of belongs to the compound. And okay, so this is essentially just the essence existence distinction that we already got into, and so I won't touch on that again. Although extension into integral parts follows corporeal nature, it is not, however, the same for a body to be a substance and to be extended. For substance is of itself indivisible, not certainly after the manner of a point, but after the manner of that which is outside the order of dimension. On the other hand, quantity, which makes a substance to be extended, really differs from substance, and it is a veritable accident. Right, so all this essentially means is that, right, substance on its own is divided by being multiple things, right? So if we're just talking about the substance of a thing, it doesn't have quantity, right? So if I'm talking about what it means to be a dog, I'm not talking about a number of dogs. But if I have corporeal creatures, if I have 3 dogs in front of me, I can talk about 3 dogs and it has quantity. All right. And so this is important. It points out for the Eucharist, right? So when we eat the Eucharist, we're not taking away parts of Christ, right? Because it's the substance of Christ we receive, not some numerical quantity. And so the number of the Eucharist is set by the accidents rather of the bread and the wine, right? If we have 2 chalices and we consecrate both of them, they remain numerically 2. Even though, of course, the substance of it, Christ, remains numerically 1. All right. Matter as subjected to quantity is the principle of individuation or numerical distinction, impossible among pure spirits, whereby the individuals of the same species are distinct from each other. All right, this is going to be a spot that Scotus is going to take significant issue with Thomas. Because matter is simply potency. It can't give something to the being. Right? What individuates one thing from another is its hypseity for Scotus. Essentially, he realizes none of the principles that have been given for principle of individuation work. And what individuates one thing from another is its thisness, right? If you were to switch out all the matter in your body, you would remain the same person, because you would remain the same haixeity, right? You would remain the same thisness. And I think even once it's not matter as such. That's really the principle of individuation for St. Thomas, but designated matter. But designated matter, we're now saying that there's this matter rather than that matter. So really all we've done is push the issue one step back, right? Because what differentiates the matter in my left hand from my right hand? Now, some Thomists have said, well, it's the form that's going to give the matter its is going to make it this matter, and so matter and form together individuate. But that still doesn't really answer the question of where it's getting it from. And so there has to be a distinct principle, which is not accounted for by our existing principles of haixeity, that's going to individuate. All right. It is also quantity that makes a body to be circumspectively in one place and to be incapable by any means of such a presence in any other place. This is just false. We have many examples of saints bilocating. I actually was curious how this says it's not possible to bilocate. And I looked into how would Thomists explain saints bilocating, and the answer I got was essentially that actually they're not bilocating, it's just an illusion. But that to me seems to destroy the miracle of bilocation. The other objection some people have brought up to this is the Eucharist. That isn't Christ present on the altar there? And their answer would be he's only substantially present, not locally present. Because for Thomas, location is, of course, an accident. So they would say, well, it still retains the accidents of the bread and wine. So Christ isn't actually locally present there. But Scotus would argue that actually there is a sense in which Christ is locally present, because otherwise there's really no meaning to us saying he's substantially present there, unless he's actually present on the altar. Once we say he's present on the altar, which we say in many hymns, at that point we've declared that there is some location to his substance. And so I think this is going to bring up both theological issues, but I think whether you're going to take a Thomist or a Scotist stance on the Eucharist, it's going to be a significant issue for explaining the lives of saints, right? I think the issue here is, yes, naturally, right? If we're speaking only by natural causes, something cannot be in more than one location at once. That is 100% true, I grant that. But it doesn't follow that it cannot be in multiple places supernaturally. And really, now that I think about it, this goes back to the earlier issue of the principle of individuation. Because if something were to bilocate, it would now be two things, because it would have two distinct sets of matter. But this is an issue for Scotus, because it can be in two spots and have the same haixeity in both spots, so be the same thing. So perhaps this is simply another reason that one should hold to haixeity as the principle of individuation rather than matter. All right, now we're getting into psychology in a second, so we'll take a look back at the chat. All right, Layman says, I think the essence existence is important in Thomism, because the essence of God is existence. In humans, it's not necessarily that. As I touched on earlier, the issue with this is not so much that things have essence in existence, but the actual way in which there is essence and existence in the thing, right? It can't be, as I objected to earlier, as one thing to another thing. It's not like it's form and matter that come together to create one substance. Rather, it's as a certain mode of being, that it exists in the actual world. And that's the way in which Scotus would say that essence and existence relate to one another. Have you read St. Thomas's commentary on Boethius's De Trinitate? He covers individuation there, including by location. I have not read that commentary, so I'll take a look at it. Thanks for letting me know, 0 Hour. All right, now the next thesis, we go on to psychology here. We're halfway through so far. All right, Thesis 13. Bodies are divided into two classes. Some are living, others without life. And living bodies, in order to have intrinsically a moving part and a moved part in the same subject, the substantial form, called the soul, requires an organic disposition or heterogeneous parts. Yeah, so all we're saying is that the soul is disposed to have a body. I wouldn't take any issue with that. But as we'll get into, the way in which that works for Scotus is a little bit different than for St. Thomas. All right, Thesis 14. Souls of the vegetative and sensitive order, properly speaking, do not subsist and are not produced, but merely exist and are produced as a principle, whereby the living thing exists and lives. Since they are depend entirely on matter, at the dissolution of the compound, they are indirectly destroyed. Right. So this is saying that vegetative and sensitive souls, right? So souls of plants and animals, once the thing dies, the soul goes away. Right? It exists only in that matter. Now, Scotus would agree with that, but he would also suggest that there's probably some underlying form of corporeality. It doesn't become something entirely different once it dies. It becomes the corpse of that thing. And so St. Thomas will say that it produced that form of the corpse, right? In its death, the act of dying produced the form of a corpse. Whereas for Scotus would say that there was already an underlying form of corporeality, which when the vegetative or sensitive soul went away, all that remained is the corporeal form, which then caused it to tend towards corruption, because it no longer, or all composed things tend towards corruption. So once it no longer has a soul animating it, keeping it alive and causing it to grow, it's just going to move towards corruption immediately. Scotus doesn't talk about this so much, though, with plants and animals. He's more interested in discussing this with humans. So he doesn't have all that much commentary on this. So I'd say if we're simply talking about plants and animals, this is a more minor debate. But when it gets to humans, it becomes a more important debate. Likewise, St. Thomas would say that there's only a singular form informing the whole thing. Whereas for Scotus, each part has a part, which itself is then ordered to the form of the whole thing, right? The corporeal form, which is itself ordered towards this vegetative or sensitive soul, which is causing it to live. As far as I can tell, Scotus doesn't clarify whether he thinks vegetative and sensitive souls are distinct in animals, while a number of other Franciscans do clarify and tend to think that those are really distinct within even animals. Right. On the contrary, the human soul subsists by itself and is created by God when it can be infused into a sufficiently disposed subject and is incorruptible and immortal by nature. So Scotus is a little skeptical of whether we can prove the immortality of the soul by nature, right? Because we can show that it's that it could exist immortally, whereas plant and animal souls to exist immortally apart from a body doesn't even make logical sense. And the human soul definitely can. But Scotus is unsure that we could prove by nature that it would really continue to exist after death. But most theologians do think you could prove it. And so Scotus would really be in a minority position there. And I don't think a Scotist would by any means have to hold to that position. I don't think there's any principle in Scotus that makes that follow necessarily. And so, yeah, right, it's created by God when it can be infused into a sufficiently disposed subject. So the body receives a rational soul and it becomes a human. Right. Thesis 16. The same rational soul is so united to the body as to be its single substantial form. By man is man, in animal and living, in body and substance and being. Soul, therefore, gives man every essential degree of perfection. It communicates to the body, furthermore, the act of existence whereby it itself exists. I would disagree with that simply for the reasons I already listed above. If people are interested in unicity versus plurality of forms, as I've been discussing here, I did a long discussion on the Dogs with Torches podcast that I'd highly recommend. Take a look at the chat again about this. Back here. Right. Faculties of a twofold order, organic and inorganic, naturally spring from the human soul. The subject of the organic, to which sense belongs, is the compound. The subject of the inorganic is the soul alone. The intellect, then, is a faculty intrinsically independent of any organ. So I'd agree, but as I said earlier, I think these would be two really distinct forms, which are the human soul. There's the rational soul of the human and the sensitive soul of the human. In the sensitive soul is essentially ordered to the rational soul, but I think it is really distinct because, right, we don't have sensation or life in terms of organic life anymore after our death. So I don't think we can say that those are contained within the rational soul. I think we have to say that those are really distinct because those are corrupted with the death of the body while the rational soul continues to exist after death. But I would agree the intellect is independent of any organ. It is essentially ordered, but the body is still essentially ordered to the intellect. So we should expect that while we are in the body, we should see the effect of the intellect on the body, and damage to the intellect would inhibit our ability to use our intellect, or damage to our body would inhibit our ability to use our intellect while we're alive. But our intellect is still immaterial, so it could continue to exist after death. All right. Intellectuality necessarily follows immateriality in such a manner that the degree of intellectuality is in proportion to the remoteness from matter. The adequate object of intellection is being as such, but the proper object of the human intellect in its present union is restricted to essences abstracted from material conditions. I can't say anything here I would think to object to. I would very much agree that we learn things by abstracting from material conditions. That's very true. We don't have ideas by a direct infusion from God. So that was Henry of Ghent's ideas, that the forms of things are directly infused into our intellect by God at the moment we see them, rather than through a mode of abstraction by the senses. And so, I would very much agree there. If we are going to talk of a divine illumination, as St. Bonaventure does, when you actually look into what St. Bonaventure means by divine illumination, he means that our intellect is made in the image of God. And so in that sense, it is illumined by things. And I think this is also St. Augustine's view of divine illumination as I understand it. And so I think that the type of divine illumination of someone like Henry of Ghent is very problematic. And that's why St. Thomas, or rather Blessed Scotus, doesn't like the term divine illumination, because what it means in his time is very different than what it meant to St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure. There's a really excellent talk on this by Timothy Noon at the Thomistic Institute, if people are interested in that, where he goes through first St. Thomas on divine illumination, then Henry of Ghent, and then Scotus, and shows how there was the shift from St. Thomas to Henry of Ghent. And then Scotus is really returning to something closer to the Aristotelian Thomistic picture here. So I would fully agree with that. We, therefore, receive our knowledge from sensible things. But since no sensible thing is actually intelligible, besides the intellect which is properly intelligent, we must admit in the soul an active power which abstracts the intelligible forms from the phantasms. I would fully agree here. This is simply, we have a passive and an active intellect. This is what Scotus would agree with, that distinction, and this is what St. Bonaventure calls memory and intellect. So for St. Bonaventure, intellect is only what Scotus and St. Thomas would call the active or agent intellect, not the passive intellect, right? Which is simply only the memory. It's what we receive as phantasms. So yeah, I'd fully agree here as well. Through these species, we know the universal. The singular we know by the senses, and also the intellect through a conversion to phantasms. We rise by analogy to the knowledge of the spiritual. Right? So we don't directly apprehend the spiritual in this life. And so we rise to it by analogy. I would agree here as well. So going back to Thesis 18, one question I have on Thesis 18, where it's saying that the degree of intellectuality is in proportion to the remoteness from matter. The problem I have with that slight aspect of it, and this is just going, I might be misunderstanding it, this is just going off the top of my head here. It would seem to me that in the resurrection, we still have a direct apprehension of God. And we established in Thesis 20 that we rise by analogy to the knowledge of the spiritual. But it seems that in the age to come, we will both know God directly, and we will know him not through the senses. And so that seems to me to be a slight issue there, but that's only a very small one I could see there. I'm probably just misunderstanding what it would mean there, because these seem to be points that Thomas would all agree on with me as well. So I'm probably just misunderstanding what's being said here slightly. I'll take a look at the chat before getting into the next one, where there's another major disagreement between. Look at the chat. All right. Wesley Corway asks, could one disagree completely on the first, with the first thesis on act and potency or wholly dividing being? I don't know if it's actually technically, there's ever been dogma anywhere of a division between act and potency, but it's so universal a principle of philosophy for the church to explain its teachings that I think you would have a hard time properly interpreting Catholic dogma without the act-potency distinction. But understanding how the act-potency distinction works could be debated a little bit, right? So for St. Thomas, this is really the primary division of being, versus for Scotus, this is really two modes in which being exists. And according to Phaser, Suarez understands the act-potency distinction as a virtual one, but I'm not sure how one would explain that, if that makes sense. I don't know Suarez well enough to know if Phaser is thoroughly representing him, because I know Phaser does misrepresent Scotus at quite a number of points. Hey, welcome, Paleologos. All right. Would it be possible to hold the sensitive soul as also subsistent? Disagreeing with one of the theses here. There's no dogma saying you can't hold the sensitive soul to be subsistent, but I think you would present philosophical issues because what is it? What am I gonna say? I think if we're talking about with the sensitive soul is the five senses and a natural will and things like that. These seem to me all be principles that require a body. So I think philosophically, I don't see how one could hold that. But I don't know if there's necessarily a dogma that you'd be a heretic for holding that the sensitive soul is immortal. I would say I think the sensitive soul can be resurrected. So I think there will be animals in the world, in the age to come, that will be resurrected, that will be numerically identical to certain animals that existed in this age. but I would say it's because they have the same hyxeity. So, right, this would be an issue because of the principle of individuation for Thomas to hold that numerically the same animal is resurrected. They would say at best a clone could be resurrected. But for Scotus, it could have the same hyxeity, so it really would be the same thing. All right. Animal souls is an interesting topic. The Old Testament distinguishes between the body and spirit and the soul as the union of two. Animals are described as the same. Are they immortal? See, I think I answered my thoughts on that above there. About act potency, I don't mean to deny it, asking if there's a middle between pure act and a being composed of potency. I think by the definition of potency, that would be very difficult, because all potency is the limitation of act. So I think you'd run into a philosophical principle there. It's a logical issue there, rather, but I'm not sure what would it be. All right. What is the Scotist understanding of hyxeity as to how exactly it individuates? So it's a formal principle within a being that is its thisness, right? So just as the form is the essence of the thing, is what it is, right? It's its quiddity. It's hyxeity or hyxeatos. It were simply saying what it is, or that it is this thing, right? So that's simply the definition of hyxeity, just like the definition of the essence is what a thing is. What I mean is, by the sensitive souls, the underlying substance or the whole that operates the souls may be also individual intentions animals form, which could be immaterial also. Yeah, so perhaps if one wanted to say the senses wouldn't exist, but right, animals can still form some sort of basic imagination, some sort of phantasms of things, and they can be still have a natural will. They still naturally tend towards an end. So perhaps you could say those are immaterial. But it seems to me there's no reason that you would have to say that those are immaterial. I see no reason that would have to be the case. It seems material principles could account for this. Right. All right. Jose Luis. I believe the middle point between pure act and potency would be what Aquinas understands as angels. No, he would see that angels still are a mix of act and potency. We went into that earlier in the stream. All right. So now Thesis 21, probably one of the biggest disagreements between Scotus and Thomas. Right. The will follows does not precede the intellect. In a sense, I would agree, it follows it does not precede the intellect. The will comes forth from the intellect. There's another sense in which it precedes in terms of nobility. The will is more noble than the intellect because it's the will in which we find the perfection of man through charity. All right. It necessarily derives that which is offered to it as a good which entirely suffices the appetite. It freely chooses among several good things that are proposed as desirable by the wavering judgment. Election, then, follows the last practical judgment. Still, it is the will determines it to be the last. No, it does not necessarily follow that which is entirely satisfies the appetite. So Scotus would agree there is a sense in which the will is an appetite, but the will is also a rational power for Scotus. So the will has the ability to choose between alternatives. So Aristotle defines two types of powers, a natural power and a rational power. So a natural power, this is in Book 9 of the Metaphysics, he goes into this, and Scotus goes into this well in his commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics called The Questions on the Metaphysics of Aristotle, Book 9. So intellect, we have two types of powers, the natural power, which naturally moves to an end, necessarily, and the rational power, which can choose between alternatives and is not necessarily determined. And it's the will which has the ability to choose between alternatives. Right, so the second part, I agree with you. It freely chooses among several good things that are proposed as desirable by the wavering judgment. So it can freely choose between alternatives. But in that case, it doesn't necessarily follow from the intellect. It does feel like here that when I hear Thomists talk about this, they sort of want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have that it follows the intellect, but also that it's free. But if it's going to be free to choose between alternatives, it has to be not necessarily determined by the intellect. And so I think Scotus is much, much superior here when it comes to determining the freedom of the will. All right, back. Could a Scotus say that God doesn't have a definition? No, he does have a definition, which is either infinite being or to be the active being. And doesn't have an intellect and will like we do, but is really beyond them in a sense. No, Scotus would say that intellect and will are pure perfections because they're immaterial perfections, and they can be unlimited. And so, as we pointed out earlier, our definition of being is univocal between God and humans for in terms of our logical definition. So likewise, intellect and will as pure perfections would also be univocal. So yes, God, there's a sense in which it's different by attribution proportionality. Right, God knows things by causing them to exist, and he doesn't freely choose things as though he's deliberating between them, but in one singular action chooses things. But no, we would say that there's still a sense in which it is univocal. Yeah, so no, this is basically what you described is the opposite of what Scotus's view is on this matter. St. Thomas would agree. He would just say that the reasons proposed by the intellect are non-necessitating ones. The thing is, when I hear this from Thomas, I feel like I get an answer, and then by the time I'm like, okay, so this is what you mean, they go back the opposite way. So I have a really hard time actually understanding what Thomists mean on this, because every time I feel like I try and explain it, I get the opposite thing. And so this is what I mean by feeling like the Thomists want to have their cake and eat it too. And I just feel like Scotus explains this very clearly by defining natural and rational powers. So I just think Scotus is superior in explaining all the issues related to this. Right. What I mean by God not having a definition is that he is not a genus. It's true that God is not a genus, but that's because genus requires being for it to be a genus. So right, things that are genuses have to be being. Being has to precede genus. And so yeah, no, this is God still has a definition because being has a definition, but God doesn't have a genus because being does not fall within genuses. Right? We have to already get to the finite being, and once we have that division of being into infinite and finite, then we can say that then we can have categories, because the categories are the divisions of finite being. And isn't possibly an essence or nature or idea that could exist as a being. No, God is a being. He is infinite being because being is named by to be. He's not a finite being, right? So when we have people like St. Dionysius saying God is not a being, what they mean is the Neoplatonic idea that he's not a finite being, but he is a being in the later scholastic sense, which is simply named from to be. I'm just laying out what Scotus's position on this. You're welcome to disagree with me, but no, you absolutely cannot, as a Scotist, say that God is not a being or God does not have intellect or will as we do, because these are some of the most basic positions of Scotism, is the univocity of the concept of being. Clarifying about the soul. In the Old Testament, body and spirit are parts of the soul, as humans are the totality of the two, nephesh. I would say that when we're getting to the biblical definition of nephesh, I would say nefesh constitutes both the sensitive and rational parts of the soul. And so, right, but it doesn't seem to constitute the vegetative part because plants are not spoken of as having nefesh. So yeah, I would just say that the biblical category here of nefesh is encountering two different principles that we would have philosophically. We could say the sensitive soul is the nefesh that's connected to materiality, that needs materiality to exist and vivifies the materiality. And we can have the nefesh that's immaterial, right? Like the rational intellect, right? Can exist apart from, well, actually, they're both immaterial, but can exist apart from matter is what I mean there. So the form is, of course, immaterial. It's not matter. All right, now last part we get into theodicy here, discussion of God. I think it means theodicy here by how we speak about God. Right. That God exists, we do not know by an immediate intuition. That is agreed upon by Scotus. We need an argument for God's existence. Nor do we demonstrate it a priori. This is where Scotus would completely disagree. He affirms the ontological argument, while Thomas is against the ontological argument for philosophical reasons. Scotus affirms the ontological argument. But certainly a posteriori, that is, by things which are made, arguing from an effect to cause. So is this true? We can argue from effects to causes, but the primary concern Scotus has with physical arguments like this is that we're arguing from things that are only potential to things which necessarily, or things that are possible to things that necessarily exist. And Scotus is concerned that you can't argue from something which is possible to something which is necessary. And so Scotus wants to say, even when we're arguing from a posteriori things, we have to find in what way they're necessary. And it's their possible existence that is necessary. And we can argue from that. So we can see that things exist. We can know they have a possibility. And then we can argue that possibility is necessary. But Scotus is very skeptical of entirely physical arguments for the existence of God, such as St. Thomas's first way. He would say there needs to be a bit more to it to really get there. And actually, St. Thomas gets to something similar in, I think it's the Summa Contra Gentiles. He agrees that really we should be making metaphysical arguments, not physical arguments for God's existence. But it's really hard to explain metaphysics to someone before we're going to give them an argument for the existence of God. So it's a lot easier that we use a physical argument, something that's more easily grasped by the person for apologetical reasons. And Scotus would mostly agree there. It's a useful apologetical argument, but it can't really necessarily establish God's existence. Namely, from things which are in movement and cannot be the adequate principle of their motion, to the first mover immovable, from the process of worldly things, from causes which are subordinate to being each other, from the first uncaused cause, and goes on so on from this. Yes, so Scotus would say all of these are useful arguments, but we need some principle of necessity before we're going to define these as certain, if that makes sense. All right, Thesis 23, we're almost at the end here. The divine essence is well proposed to us as constituted in its metaphysical concept by its identity, with exercised actuality of its existence. In other terms, at the very subsisting being, by the same token to us, the reason of its infinity of perfection. Yeah, right. So essentially there's two primary definitions we can have from God here. That he's pure actuality, exists, subsisting being, or that he's infinite being or infinite perfection. So yes, which one they prefer to talk about? Scotus and Thomas prefer to talk about the opposite ones. Thomas tends to talk about subsisting being, while Scotus tends to talk about infinite being, but both of them would affirm the other one is true as well. By the very purity of his being, God is, therefore, distinguished from all finite beings. Hence, in the first place, it is inferred that the world could not have proceeded from God except through creation. Secondly, that the creative power, which directly affects being as being, cannot be communicated, even miraculously, to some finite nature. And finally, that no created agent exercises any influence on the being except through a motion received from the first cause. Scotus would agree with that as well. Looking in the down here, though, it says that this motion received into the agent previously to the agent's motion is called premotion. And since the agent to the exercise of its powers, it is properly called physical premotion. On this, Scotus would disagree with physical premotion. This issue isn't actually really in St. Thomas yet. It's in Banyas, a later Thomist. But I think we can say with Mastrius' solution to this is that God can give the soul the actuality, that it can exercise its power as a rational potency, that it can freely choose by the power given to it. So I'd agree that there has to be some sort of influence given to it, but I don't think that that influence has to be a physical premotion. I don't think a Scotus could agree with physical premotion because of the way Scotus understands the soul. All right. Don't Scotus hold that God, insofar as he is a set of creatable, he isn't in the set of creatable beings, and so isn't a single essence that can exist or not exist, isn't a being. So if we define by being simply created beings or finite beings, he's not a being in that sense. But if we simply mean being as a noun which comes from to be, then he is a being in that sense. All right. Why don't we attribute wetness or geometrical extensions to God if all things reflect his being? How can God be the source of these if we can't attribute them to God like we attribute intellect or will to God? This is an excellent question. So when we attribute intellect or will to God, or infinity, or anything like that, these are attributed as what we call pure perfections. These are things that can be attributed that directly to being itself. There is nothing in them that is limited, right? This actually comes from St. Anselm. So St. Anselm argues that God is not limited. But when we talk about something like wetness or geometrical extension, these are things that can only be predicated of finite beings, right? So this is Guanilo's response to Anselm, is that we can only have a maximally great why can't we have a maximally great island with the ontological argument? But the problem is an island is not a there's no pure perfection of an island because it's a finite being. You can always add one more tree, right? So with geometrical extension, you can always add one more mile to something, right? You can always add one more drop of water to make something wet. The way that these things are in things, wetness or geometrical extension, is by cause. So when St. Maximus, for example, is talking about the logi, he says that the logi are in things by being cause. The logi are not actually that these things are in God, but rather the logi are God's will to create these things. So they pre-exist in God as God's will to create these things. And St. Bonaventure calls these the vestiges of God in things. That it's not as though these things are in God by way of attributing them as an attribute to God, but by way of causality. And so we can discuss God. This is actually where we could just simply use analogy, right? So Scotus would say this is an example where when we talk about, right, God is the rock of our salvation, as scripture calls him, right? And a rock we find on the ground is a rock. That's an analogy, but logically it falls into equivocity. And God has an infinite intellect, and we have a finite intellect. Yes, when we start thinking about how our intellect works, the way God's intellect works is only analogically related to ours. But intellect itself, this ability to understand things, that itself is not limited by finite or infinite, and so it could be infinite within things. First, another comment from you came up about that, but I think I already answered that. It might have come up late on my streams. I know StreamYard tends to delay comments by a few seconds. So feel free to drop in another comment if you're still confused at what I said. God cannot be defined. Whatsoever is defined is comprehended by the intellect, and God is incomprehensible to the intellect. Hence, it is not a definition of God when we say that he is pure act. That's actually, I think, correct, actually. Thanks for correcting me there, 0 Hour. That, properly speaking, it's not really a definition. What we're really defining here is the concept of being, and then saying that God is infinite being. So yes, you are correct. In a sense, it's not a definition. So thank you for that. All right. Would Scotus's view on univocity in relation to theosis lead to pantheism? That's a common orthodox critique I've heard. No, it would not lead to pantheism, because we're not saying, right, when we talk about created things, we're talking about being in a certain mode. It's only a concept of being that we're talking about here, something with the definition of to be. It's not as though this is an actual common being that they're sharing, right? It's not as though they're made of the same substance. All right, a question here. If the distinction of essence and existence is formal and not real, as in Thomism, that would include some kind of composition. In the being of God, as Etienne Gilson argues. No, because we don't think that essence and existence are compositions within a created thing. So of course they're not composition within God either. Right. So in God, I would say that God can only be in the mode of existing, right? So this is actually, I'm thinking about it, you can sort of formulate this along the lines of an ontological argument, right? If you consider the existence of God, right? God can either exist in the mode of not existing or existing. It would be a contradiction if we said that God doesn't exist. So God must exist, right? And all of these really come back to the fact that God is a necessarily existing being. So you can formulate lots of different versions of the ontological argument that are approaching the issue from the same way. But no, even within created beings, it's not a composition of two things. It's a different mode in which it exists. Let me scroll up to see if there's any earlier questions I missed. Absurd Scandal asks, is it true that Scotism doesn't view the difference between God and creation as essence existence, but intrinsic modes? Yes, essentially that's the case, as I explained earlier. This is the craziest view or idea a Scotist, medieval or modern, came up with as a metaphysical opinion. I have no clue on that. I guess it would depend on what you'd consider crazy. Is there any dogma based on the Thomistic view? Nothing I know of that a Scotist would disagree with has been made dogma, but certain things have been defined along more Thomistic lines. So like the explanation of the Eucharist you'll get at Trent is going to follow along a more Thomistic line, but hasn't excluded a Scotist explanation. Likewise, the Immaculate Conception, though, if you read the actual full papal encyclical on Effibalis Deus, you're going to see it's actually defined along a Scotistic line, that Mary is immaculately conceived, but she is decreed in one and the same, or she is predestined in one and the same decree with Christ, which would seem to raise some issues from the Thomistic side. But that part, of course, is also not dogma. It's not part of the definition. Will you have a conversation with Aris? Yeah, I've been meaning to have Aris on my channel at some point. That's all the questions that were there. Let me scroll back down. Could feelings or effects be understood under Scotist univocity? I mean, in a panpsychist way. If God understands as we understand, could we say the same about the way he and us feel? No, I don't think this is the case, because feelings are that we pass from one state to another state of feeling. Right, because even when God thinks, he doesn't think in the same way we do. What we mean is that intellect is defined the same way for God and for us, not that it operates in the same way that we do. So likewise with feelings, right? We could say God is love, but the way in which we're defining love is not the same way in which it would be for us. Likewise, when we say in the Bible, right, God is angry, it's not in the same way we are for us. Just as even though we have intellect, the way in which God thinks is still different from us, if that makes sense. To clarify what I meant, I'm scrolling up. God doesn't have anything that would make him a creatable being. And being an individual with definite properties seems like you must be creatable. God isn't an individual with definite properties, though. What's the difference of modes of being in Scotism and the Thomis Actus Ascendi? Yeah, so Thomas is going to define being as the act as actuality, right? The actus ascendi, the act of being. While for Scotus, this division of act and potency follows from being, but isn't its definition. So it's the question of what's the starting point when we're just defining being as we use it in metaphysics. Okay, but how do pure perfections relate to wetness in geometricity? How can God's nature be the source of even attributes strictly for finite beings if it's not like those? Yeah. So we're defining those logically in an equivocal mode. Those are in God by way of God's causing them, not with the same actual thing within God. So that's really strictly an analogy, and it's really equivocal logically. And it's in God by mode of causing them. Okay. But when we have finite beings, when we have something like a pure perfection, we're defining it in the same way for both. This is really especially coming from St. Anselm. The more I read Scotus, the more I'm convinced St. Anselm is really, really important for Scotus. And he's making a lot of early versions of a lot of the moves Scotus is going to make, whether it be on pure perfections, the ontological argument, and his explanation of free will is very close to Scotus compared to Thomas, who's much closer to Aristotle on free will. All right, I'll give it another little bit for anyone who else wants a comment to drop one. Give it another 30 seconds or so. And if not, I'll just end the stream. All right, well, while we're wrapping up, I'll just drop some plugs. So if you like this video, put it up on your Patreon, or rather put it up on your social media. If you like this channel, you can also support it on Patreon. Help the algorithm by liking and commenting on this video. I've had some new interviews up on my YouTube channel. I know I haven't posted in a while because I've been busy. But I've had an interview with Swansona about natural law. And I just had a very long interview with Ryan Grant about the life and works of St. Robert Bellarmine that I'm going to be uploading probably later today on my Patreon. So for $5, you can support that. And yeah. All right, I got some more questions in the meanwhile. So I'll answer those. All right. I already answered How can God cause them if he isn't the source of them in some way? Are wetness and geometricity and flow from God's nature in some way? Yes, they are still in God in the sense that they're in his intellect, right? God sees all possible worlds and he wills to create one particular world. So they're in God by God knowing and willing to cause them. He knows them by the fact that they could possibly exist, and he wills them to actually exist. So in that sense, they're rooted in God. And so they're still a reflection of the divine nature. Because God, right, everything is a reflection of the divine nature. But it's the reflections of the divine nature as through a mirror, as St. Bonaventure says, rather than in a univocal way. To say God causes them implies they somehow float out there like ideas not sourced in God at all. No, so they still exist in God in his intellect. So Scotus will actually say that modal possibility within modal logic is only possible because God first thinks of all possibilities within his intellect. Any thoughts on John Milbank? Yeah, he's a complete clown. Basically, every actual scholar of Scotus disagrees with pretty much everything John Milbank has written on Scotus. He's not taken seriously by any scholars of Scotus. And what is it? Yeah, I actually talked with him on Twitter about different scholars of Scotus, and every scholar of Scotus I could name except his pet scholar was he just said they were out of date and they were bad, including people who are very well recognized as leading scholars in Scotus, such as Alan Walter or Mary Beth Ingham or Anton Voss, or Timothy Noon. Basically, anyone I could name, he just immediately dismissed. And then I asked him if he's actually read them, and he told me he hasn't read them. So he's just dismissing them, even though he hasn't read them. All right. And also, Milbank gets Thomas completely wrong as well. He completely misunderstands lots of passages in Thomas. And also, if you actually read Milbank, he says that St. Francis's spirituality caused all this messed up theology in the Franciscan order, which ultimately led to the destruction of the West. So I don't see how a Catholic can, in good faith, hold a radical Orthodox position. Scotus. Anselm has differences in his soteriology than Scotus. Yeah, he does have differences in how he explains the atonement. If people are interested, I did a long discussion on the atonement in Scotus, where we do contrast him with Anselm with Dr. Jared Goff, and that's up on my Patreon for people who are interested. Could you go into more detail on how they reflect God's nature? And what's the difference between pure perfections and geometricity reflect God's nature? What might help you, I think, with this, two works, St. Anselm's Monologion, I think will help you understand pure perfections, and St. Bonaventure's Itinerarium, which goes either by like the mind's road into God or the journey of the mind into God, by St. Bonaventure will, I think, help you understand how things are reflected. So I think if you want to look more into that, I'd recommend those two works, the Itinerarium of Bonaventure and the Monologion of St. Anselm. And Dr. Gregory Sadler on YouTube has done some very good videos on St. Anselm's Monologion if you want to look to watch those to better understand it. So yeah. Seems hard to get away from a necessary being, no matter what. The question just means by what one is the purest. Simple things at the bottom of reality. Theism beats literal blocks. You're going to have to get back to some basic principle. And this creates a big issue within the philosophy of atomism, where they're having a hard... And I don't deny the existence of atoms, to be clear. But I think the philosophy around the modern science of atoms is running into an issue where they can't really root it in anything. They don't have a good definition of matter. What are your thoughts on David Bentley Hart's Meltdown? I don't really follow anything from David Bentley Hart. I don't really take him all that seriously anymore, to be honest. What's your favorite comedy hour? I haven't watched many of Michael Lofton's comedy hours, so I can't comment on them. I did see one of his ones on Stephen Anderson. That was funny. And another one of his on the people who were claiming that the Bible itself is the mark of the beast. And that one was pretty funny as well. Do you know E. Michael Jones and his work? Yeah, I do know of E. Michael Jones. I haven't really read any of his books. I've seen some interviews with him. It seems like he has some good stuff, but there's also some slight issues with some of his stuff. So I'm not trying to give a full endorsement or a full denunciation of him. Seems like he has a mixed bag of material. All right. Richard Cross is another good scholar of Scotus. I will say Richard Cross has some idiosyncratic readings of Scotus at some points, in which case I wouldn't follow him there. So I'd give a little bit of a caution with him, but he does have some really excellent stuff, especially on Scotus's Trinitarian theology. That really helped me understand that. Do you think you can fit Actus Purus in Scotus's theology? Yeah, I think you can definitely fit it in. I haven't seen Scotus use the words there, but I'm sure he'd affirm it. But he would essentially, where do you want to start with our definition of God? Right? Are we going to talk first God more generally of infinite being or of Actus Purus? So it's more a choice of what we're going to put an emphasis on rather than a genuine difference in theology. What would be your take on radical orthodoxy? Basically everything I said above with John Milbank. Can you give a simple definition of the formal distinction? No, but I can't really give a simple definition of it, because it is very complicated. I'd highly recommend starting off with Alan Walter's book, Transcendentals and Their Function in the Metaphysics of Duns Scotus by Alan Walter. You can actually find it free on archive.org and read the chapter on the formal distinction. I think that will help a lot. Read the whole book, really. It's great. But Scotus hold that all created beings are entirely contingent. They're absolutely necessary in some respect. I know he would hold that all created things are entirely contingent. Yeah, Thomas Williams, again, like Richard Cross, has some idiosyncratic readings of Scotus, but overall, I've heard good things about him. He doesn't he does explain those sorts of things. He talks about how, not in detail, how lots of things reflect God, but he gives you a mindset for working through the things in a very, very poetic way. I think would help you out a lot. Where is the 24 Theses found? Just Google for them. You can find multiple different translations of them online. I just went with the one that was the first one on Google. What do you think of Mark of Ephesus is claiming the Sixth Council dogmatizes energies? Cabane takes the same view. So, energia in Greek is simply the underlying Greek word which got translated octus in the Latin. So I think it doesn't really answer the question of what we mean by energies, right? It's simply stating, and even what Palamites mean by energies, there seems to be some disagreement upon. I think we're asking the question, what do we mean by energies? Right. The Sixth Council is talking about the activity of Christ. And so it would have to be a larger abstraction in argument abstracting out. But I am not convinced from reading St. Maximus, whose theology is dogmatized at the Sixth Council, that Maximus is saying exactly what Polemos is saying is the same thing as. But the problem with reading Polemos, I've found, is that most of his stuff is untranslated from the Greek. And my Greek is not good enough to read him. So that's a big issue here. What do you think of modern versions of Scotus's modal cosmological argument? I'd be a big fan of them. I don't know of any modern versions. So if you know of some modern versions, please pass them along to me because I'd be interested. Can you give a Scotist evaluation of the 95 Lutheran Theses? Yeah, that would be interesting to do at some point. The absurd scandalous, getting into creationism would be a whole separate topic right now. We could do a future stream on that, but I don't want to get down that rabbit hole right now. Are you familiar with John Connor's pan-computational Thomism? I'm not aware of it at all. Drop any more questions people have below. I'd be happy to answer them. All right. What's the easiest way to explain / understand the Holy Trinity? I made a video on the Trinity that I think explains it well. It wasn't my best video ever, but I think I did an okay job explaining stuff, so I'd recommend that video. Do Scotus believe in divine? Yeah, Scotus does believe in divine simplicity, but he's a little more broad on it than the Thomists would be. That would be a whole separate rabbit hole to get into right now. But Scotus would affirm that the divine attributes are identical to the divine essence, but Scotus would say that the divine attributes themselves are not ultimately reducible to one another. So that's the fundamental part where Scotus would want to make some nuances on divine simplicity from Thomas's position. What do you think of burning the dead? I'm completely against it. It used to be completely not allowed by canon law in the Catholic Church. What do you think of Michael Heiser? Michael Heiser has a lot of really, really excellent material and a lot of unbelievably terrible material. I think if you can read with a discerning eye, The Unseen Realm is an excellent, excellent book to read, but you have to be able to read with a discerning eye. So yeah, that's where I'd put it. I have seen from a little bit of stuff I've seen from Stephen DeYoung, he seems to be stripping away a lot of the issues in Heiser's work, but I don't really know that much, so I don't want to give an endorsement of him or anything. Do you think the Palamites have a correct or valid interpretation of St. Maximus the Confessor and Dionysius the Areopagite? I at least think the Neo-Palamites don't. I actually have seen some issues with, what's his name? Constas's translations of Maximus, because I think he reads Palamism into certain passages in Maximus. How would Scotus approach God's contingent will to create the world if it's not a part? So it can't be a contingent self-caused aspect of God without it being necessary. Yeah, this gets into probably one of the most complicated area of where philosophy and theology run into issues. But yeah, I want to read up more on Bartholomew Mastrius, who wrote quite a bit on this. So I don't want to give a definitive answer to it yet before I read up more on this. I know I've heard who Proust is, but I haven't read any Proust. Yeah, I think any form of contraception is inherently evil. I did answer about the modal cosmological arguments. No, yeah, I agree with Scotus's version, but I haven't seen any modern versions of it. If there are any, I'd be interested to see them. Question I've had for a while is how do we actually come to a conclusion with something like the formal distinction? I can get the concept from different sides, but I can't tell which is true. I think it's useful to answer other issues right? So if we're seeing it's a useful thing that keeps coming up to explain things, we can get that we need it to answer certain philosophical issues. Because all distinctions is useful tools that we come up with to explain other things. What do you think of J. Dyer's transcendental argument? I'm not all that aware of it, but I think it's based on his presuppositionalism, in which case I would take some issues with it. Do you have a favorite icon? I don't know if I have a favorite one. I think it might just be Christ and Mary, like the one I have right here. I really love this icon. Yeah, I did answer it earlier with essentially a dodge that I'm not entirely sure on the topic. I'd recommend reading Bartholomew Mastrius, but he's untranslated, unfortunately, from the Latin. If you are interested in this and you can read Latin, Bartholomew Mastrius has a long discussion of it in his commentary on the sentences in the first book, and it's actually available on Google Books. The issue I've had is it's an older printing, so I find the font really weird and hard to get over. I know, do you have an opinion on Meister Eckhart? I know in his life, Scotus and Eckhart got into a dispute over the primacy of the intellect versus the primacy of the will. And I've heard from a Scotist I trust that he is not a fan of Meister Eckhart. But I also know quite a people who are fans of Meister Eckhart who've explained stuff to me, and I haven't seen many issues with stuff I've heard from them. But I do know Scotus, one of Scotus' students, was instrumental in Eckhart's condemnation, which makes me skeptical. What do you think of the charismatic renewal? I mean, I think it's a good thing if it's bringing about more fruits. You know, like if you go to some of these charismatic things, that you have people who are on fire for Christ, and I 100% support that. I think that that's great. You have these people who are forming strong communities, and they're doing evangelism. I know like someone who was involved in one where they would even share money with one another, living in a sort of semi-monastic sort of way. And I think that's all excellent. I highly support that. My only concern is when it comes to liturgy, are we destroying the final causality of liturgy when we make liturgy too informal? And I think it's important that liturgy be very formal and ordered, and we have a very deep theology to our prayers, that it be chanted. And I'm concerned that bringing that charismatic aspect into the Mass itself, or into a liturgy itself, could do things to harm it. And that's my concern. What would Scotus think of nominalism? Scotus was completely against nominalism. Nominalism by Occam was in part formulated in response to Scotus. Is there a way to learn Latin without formal education? I learn Latin by formal education, so I can't recommend necessarily a particular resource on it. My college only has classical Latin. Just take classical Latin. You can, in a few minutes, learn the ecclesiastical pronunciation, so that's an extremely easy switch to make. And all ecclesiastical Latin is the vocabulary will be a little bit different, but you'll pick that up by just reading ecclesiastical Latin. So yeah, no, ecclesiastical Latin is just simpler than classical Latin. Yeah, so if you're going to take a class at a college, just take classical Latin. I mean, I took mostly classical Latin, so. Do you think usury is charging any interest or charging exorbitant interest? I think it's charging any interest, but there can be certain kinds of loans that would not fall under that. They're not directly charging interest. So I think it's more has to do with kind than amount. So Thomas Stork, in his book, In Economics of Justice and Charity, has a really excellent appendix explaining this. So I'd highly recommend that book. What's your favorite Bible version? For most of the Bible, it's the Revised Standard Version Catholic edition. But for St. Paul's letters, I think the Dewey-Reams is better. As a whole, I tend to prefer the Dewey-Reams, except for the fact that the names are completely ridiculous. Like, they don't follow any standard English conventions of spelling, which just makes it confusing. And it also makes it annoying to read biblical scholarship because it's using different names from it. And also, it doesn't have footnotes of variant readings. So actually, I really want, if anyone's interested in this, please contact me. Is I want to have a project of making a new Dewey Reams. It's like there was a new King James, right, that updated the language of the King James and put in modern style footnotes of variant readings. I think we really need a new Dewey Reams where we're going to update the language of the Dewey Reams, fix the spelling of all the names to be in line with modern conventions, and footnote all possible variant readings. I think this would be a really excellent project. It would be an extremely difficult project to do, though. You need reading of Greek and Hebrew to get all those variant readings. I think you probably could update a lot of the language using computer programming, though. Yeah, it would be a very interesting project to take up, and one I'd love to take up at some point in my life. What's your favorite ice cream flavor? I tend to like vanilla, honestly. Different toppings and stuff on it, but it varies on my mood. I'm not really the biggest ice cream fan, though. You know, I'd usually rather have like a bag of chips or like a cake than ice cream. Peter Abelard? I mean, he was technically Catholic, but if you read his beliefs, they were pretty not Catholic. How would you explain the relationship between Scotus philosophy and Franciscan charism / mysticism? Yeah, the book you want to get on this is, what is it called? Nothing for Your Journey by Ephraim Potenti, where he explains how the example of St. Francis inspired a lot of the themes that were taken up within the Scotist philosophical tradition. So he always starts off with the example of St. Francis, then shows how St. Bonaventure puts this in a mystical way, and then how Scotus sort of systematizes it. I'd highly recommend that. And the ice cream question now makes me want to get some ice cream after this. It's more influenced with Scotus's theology / philosophy, more influenced by Aristotelianism or Neoplatonism. When he's talking about natural physics issues, he tends to be more influenced by Aristotle, but this might be simply because of the fact that he's commenting on Aristotle when talking about these issues. Because he tends to take Aristotle, but then sometimes go off in a very different direction than Aristotle went. On issues of God, though, he's very Neoplatonist. So he's very influenced by Augustine and Anselm and Bonaventure on these issues. What do you think of Robert Alter's new translation of the Old Testament? I don't think I've read that. I do have a Jewish translation of the Pentateuch. Maybe that's the one by Robert Alter, but I don't know. The Augustine Bible by the Augustine Institute is very good. Yeah, I've been interested to look into that one. I've seen good things. It uses a version of Tobit much closer to the Vulgate version of Tobit, which I think is very good. The Revised Standard version of Tobit is significantly different than the Vulgate version, which led to a little bit of confusion when I was told to read that in Tobit and Marriage Prep, and I read the wrong version. A favorite patristic, medieval, and modern commentator on the Bible. A favorite patristic. There's quite a lot of different patristic commentaries that are interesting. Probably either Augustine for more literal issues in the text, or Maximus for more mystical issues in the text. A favorite medieval commentator. I actually haven't read many medieval commentaries on scripture. Actually, now that I think about it, St. Thomas's commentaries on St. Paul are really, really excellent. I'd highly recommend those. So I'll say St. Thomas is my favorite medieval commentator. And favorite modern commentator has to be James Jordan by far and away. I did a long discussion on James Jordan with a number of other people on this channel like about a month ago or so. Favorite Protestant scholars. It's going to be James Jordan and Peter Leithart by far. On usury, does money have a cost? I mean, I haven't worked out all the principles of how usury would work with the actual economics of money. I think that's a project that needs to be taken up, and I think there are sources on this that just haven't been looked at all that much. But I think from a moral philosophy standpoint, you can't say that usury is acceptable. Favorite Italian food is probably pizza. But yeah, I like pasta a lot. Honestly, is there such a thing as bad Italian food? What do you think is the best way to deal with the problem of evil? I honestly haven't dealt with the problem of evil all that much. I'd say probably just the permissive for human free will. You could say God's permitting it for some greater good, right? This is the theodicy we get in Genesis 50. And I'd say natural evil is the result of the fall. It's a punishment for the sin of Adam and Eve. Do you think reading the Bible in Latin or English is better? The big advantage of Latin is if you're reading the Scholastics, you'll be aware of the terminology they're using. And so, yeah, I just say essentially you're getting that advantage. And also the church has said that the Vulgate, it doesn't say that it's the closest to the original. But they say that it's free from any doctrinal error because God wouldn't cause the church to use an errant Bible for like 1,000 years. So yeah, there's advantages to using the Latin. There's advantages to reading in English. Obviously, ideally, you'd want to learn Greek and Hebrew to read those. But I know some Greek, enough to read the New Testament, and I'd like to learn Hebrew. Have you seen Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World? The only episodes of it I saw are his episodes on creationism and the flood, so I could prepare for my debate with him. And yeah, I think you saw my thoughts on those in the debate. I haven't listened to any other stuff within him. I haven't read really anything by Seventh-day Adventists, so I wouldn't know how they harmonize the Old Testament and the New Testament. What do you think of Protestant Bible commentators? I mean, I endorsed some earlier. I think James Jordan and Peter Leithart are really excellent. I haven't read Craig Keener. N.T. Wright, I think, is useful if you read with a discerning eye. I think he's very good at seeing how St. Paul is connecting to the narrative flow of the Old Testament. And I think that's a really excellent thing to read in him. But I think on issues of historical theology or systematic theology, he's very problematic. I hold to a partial preterist reading of the Book of Revelation. But I also hold to a typological reading. So I think the events in Revelation are recapitulated whenever there's a crisis in the church. So I don't think futurist readings or historicist readings are wrong. But I'd say they flow forth from the preterist reading, in the partial preterist reading. I think Maximus and Augustine are compatible on everything except predestination. Maximus holds something much closer to a he essentially holds to a conditional election and holds that the election is the election of all of mankind, while Augustine holds that election refers to the election of individuals. So I'd say on predestination they're different, but on everything else I actually think they're very compatible. How would you describe the ideas of Scotist philosophy as well as Franciscan influence in Scottish philosophy? Okay. I don't really know much about Scottish philosophy besides a little bit of David Hume I've read, so I don't know. You got to refute old heresies. It depend on the heresy. Some adoptionist heresy. Actually, N.T. Wright could be useful for showing from the Bible that Christ is God. He does have some... I think N.T. Wright's actual Christology that he develops from it is problematic for other reasons, but he is useful in terms of showing how Christ is God from the New Testament. Annihilationism. I think annihilationism is wrong on more systematic grounds, but I will admit from just the text of Scripture alone that it would be very hard to refute annihilationism. So I'd take that more on the tradition of the church than something I could 100% prove from the text of Scripture. But I don't think you can't prove eternal conscious torment from the text of Scripture. I think that when I read up quite a bit in annihilationism a few years ago, especially Chris State's work on it, and it was quite good, I will admit. He made good arguments. But I think both of us can only make that argument by... We'll take certain things and say, okay, these are metaphorical, these are literal. And he'll say the other way, no, these are metaphorical and these are literal. And I felt it sort of went on an endless trend down of that. I haven't read Carmelite Mystics. But actually, I read a little bit of St. John of the Cross, and he affirms a sort of tripartite version of the soul as memory, intellect, and will, similar to how St. Bonaventure does. So I found that interesting. What's the view on predestination you think is best? I need to read up more on the subject, but I tend to lean towards a unconditional election view. But I'm skeptical. I don't like Boniez's arguments for it. I think Boniez's arguments for it are philosophically wrong. How would I deal with people who said that Paul is not an apostle? I'd point out that all the other apostles endorsed him, and all the early Christians endorsed him. Right? So we would expect that the other apostles wouldn't have endorsed him. I don't think getting a tattoo in itself is sinful, but I think in many cases it could be sinful. I haven't really thought about the issue all that much, to be honest. I'm not interested in getting a tattoo. So getting a tattoo is pretty cringe, though. So, except Christus Victor or another theory. I'm a big defender of the satisfaction theory of atonement, specifically that Christ's obedience is what merited our salvation. I did a very long interview with Jared Goff on that on my Patreon if people are interested. Why do so many modern Orthodox speak bad of Augustine and his theology? I think it's a lot of them just simply don't have much knowledge on what Augustine actually thought. I did a long response on the issue of original sin to Romanides and Meyendorff, though. It's on my channel. What are your political views in regard to the faith? Integralism? We consider myself an integralist, but I don't agree with every formulation of integralism. So I'd fall more in sort of the Andrew Willard-Jones New Polity camp of integralism. I actually have an article that at some point will come out in New Polity. It's still in the editing stage right now. But yeah, no, I endorse them. But I think that, what is it? Yeah, I think that Crean and Phimister, their book on integralism is very good in that it lays it out systematically, even if I wouldn't agree on every little detail. I'd still highly recommend that book. But yeah, there's some integralists I might take issues with. So for example, I disagree with Vermeule very much on his views of the administrative state. I have been reading his book on common good constitutionalism, and I find that quite interesting. And I don't know enough on law to evaluate it, but it seems good. All right. I don't know if I have a favorite Bible verse. Do you consider formal distinction and patristic to agree as Palamites? So if a Palamite is going to understand the essence energy's distinction as formal, I don't think a Scotist would take issue with that then. And would agree there's precedence within. I think the way that Maximus is trying to describe the relationship of the logi to the one logos, I think that's probably he's trying to get at something like the formal distinction. Yeah, John, I don't think I'm trying to say that all Orthodox would have to dislike St. Augustine. I liked St. Augustine when I was Orthodox, so. I'd say all the time that we make puns in languages where we change the gender. I think this is simply an issue you're going to frequently encounter in gendered language. I just read a new atonement in Leviticus by J. Greenberg, and he argues quite well that the blood of the sacrifice is a connecting agent. That's interesting. Yeah, I'd highly recommend Peter Leithart's book on the atonement. He does a good job analyzing Leviticus. I haven't read that particular book on Leviticus, but Peter Leithart does a really great job integrating. We can't just look at Leviticus or just look at one book. Peter Leithart wants to look at many sections. Let's see, do I have his book around I can grab here easily? I don't know where I placed my copy of it, but Peter Lightheart has a great explanation, right? That we have to integrate what St. Paul says about the atonement, what the Gospels say about the atonement, what Leviticus says about the atonement, the whole narrative of the Old Testament, the typology, the fall of Adam. We have to integrate all of this into one theory of an atonement that explains all of these in their own. So we need to show how each of them teaches it in their whole. And I think that satisfaction theory of atonement through the obedience of Christ is the best way to explain that. So I wouldn't deny other theories of atonement, but I'd say those other theories are subordinate to the satisfaction account. So I'd say, for example, recapitulation of Christ as the last Adam explains how Christ restores justice. But I'd say it's the restoration of justice that's the primary purpose of Christ's death. I had an idea recently, isn't it? A connection between God says, I am who I am, and when Mary says, I am the Immaculate Conception. No, you're really onto something. St. Maximilian Kolbe says the same thing, that there's two I ams, right? God defines who he is based on himself, and Mary defines who she is based on what God did for her in making her immaculately conceived. And God revealed that through the burning bush, and Mary is a burning bush, right? She contains God within herself. Mary is frequently iconographically depicted as the burning bush. I know I don't have any debates coming up. It takes quite a while to prepare for one. Thoughts on perennialism? Yeah, I would say I think that some perennialists can offer some useful things, but as a whole, it's essentially trying to resurrect paganism, and so that's very problematic. But I read some books by Wolfgang Smith, who tends to lean somewhere between Catholic and perennialist, and I found a lot of useful stuff in him. So I think if you read with a discerning eye, some perennialists can be useful. No, I don't agree with separation of church and state. I'd say the two have to be distinct, but I think that the state has to be subordinate to the church. Thanks for the compliment, John. So all Catholics have to believe in predestination. It's taught by the church, and it's also taught by the Bible. The Bible uses the word predestination. The question is only whether that predestination is unconditional or conditional. And on that issue, the Catholic Church has left it open since the time of the De Auxiliis controversy, where the Church refused to resolve the issue. What's your opinion on the Crusades? I mean, they were good in intention, but frequently bad in how they actually happened. Not sure what you're asking, Joe Worley. Yeah, so is it okay to eat meat with blood in it? Yeah, the Council of Florence explains that this was only a temporary provision in the Book of Acts, and so the church can make it no longer binding, which it has. It was simply not to scandalize the Jews by the Gentile converts coming in. Is it true that Christ spoke to Moses through the burning bush? Yes. What's your opinion on Kabbalah? I don't know much about it, but it doesn't seem very good. I don't focus on Islamic apologetics really ever. All right, the stream's getting to about 2 hours, so I think I'm going to end it here. Or I'll give another few seconds for people to drop comments. Let's see. All right, well, it looks like there's no more comments here. So thank you, everyone, for watching. If you like this video, you can like it, comment below. That helps the algorithm. Subscribe to my channel to see more videos, and hit the bell notification so you can be notified whenever new videos come out. If you want to support this channel, you can support it on Patreon. You can donate any amount of money, but for $5 a month, I have exclusive monthly interviews. I have a ton out so far. I have one on the atonement. I have one on Scotism and therapy. I have one on Eric von Quenelt-Leden and Russell Kirk, rather. Just recently, last month, did an interview with who is it? Swan Sona on natural law, and I have a new interview I'm going to be uploading later today with Ryan Grant on St. Robert Bellarmine, his life and works. Ryan Grant went on for about an hour on the life of St. Robert Bellarmine. It's really, really fascinating. Tons of stuff I'm sure very few people here know. And then for $10 a month, it was initially early access to videos for $10 a month, but I don't really do anything recorded anymore. So I'm trying to come up with a new benefit for $10 a month supporters. So if you're a $10 a month supporter and you have something you want, let me know and I can try and come up with something. But thank you everyone for watching. And yeah, thank you and have a good day.